Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the concept of the psychopath and how that concept relates to the concept of the sociopath and the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. First, I would start out by pointing out that there is much debate among clinicians and researchers in regards to the differentiation of psychopaths, sociopaths, and those with antisocial personality disorder. Although my impression is that the diagnosis in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which is used to diagnose mental disorders, the diagnosis antisocial personality disorder has some of the characteristics of what we would consider the psychopath, but is probably more consistent with what we would consider to be a sociopath. Psychopath seems to be a more, I want to say maybe more intense and stronger characteristics of antisocial behavior and thoughts in that regard. That you don't see sociopath or psychopath being diagnostic terms in the manual, and you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute here. So that's one of the problems, and of course then we start looking at the age factor. That characteristics of psychopathy begin showing up relatively early in childhood. We also have a diagnosis conduct disorder for children and adolescents that may be applied as a diagnostic category or a mental disorder, if you will. And what we do find is that many children or adolescents who are diagnosed as having conduct disorder grow out of it and do not go on to, if the symptoms persist, they would then be diagnosed when they're adults with antisocial personality disorder. One of the big questions that remains is what differentiates those that go on to have antisocial personality disorder diagnosis and those that don't. One of the things, of course, is the later the onset, such as in adolescence, the more likely it will desist in adulthood. But going back, the psychopath, probably the gold standard is Hare's PCLR, and the text, or rather the book, really Robert Hare's Without Conscience, and this was published a while back, but this is still, I think, considered to be one of the major textbooks that introduces us in many ways. And of course, there's a whole bunch of research conducted by a variety of those studying psychopaths. And there's, like I mentioned, some disagreements in how you define it. There's a bunch of tests that we can use to determine if someone would be considered a psychopath or not. Some of those, and the ones that I would use in clinical practice, are actually copyrighted and protected for mental health professionals, meaning that you cannot distribute the information on how they're scored and everything else. In other words, it's kind of, information that is exchanged between those that work in the field, but not the general public. And you have to have certain credentials in order to purchase the actual test. But what I will point out in Hare's test to determine if someone's psychopath or not, I think looking at the characteristics would be very relevant. So I want to mention those, and then we can contrast those with what's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But Hare basically looked at several factors, and these were superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self-worth. What we're really talking about there is narcissism, thinking one is a great person. Pathological lying, so you have this consistent lying, and conning and also manipulative behavior, a lack of guilt, very shallow feelings or affect, as one would say, so shallow affect or feelings. Also a lack of empathy, that's the callousness that we see, and also the failure to accept responsibility for one's actions. And these are basically what are considered to be the tools of the psychopath, what one might see a psychopath using to get things. And then when we see problems, deficiencies with the psychopath, for example, Hare points out these as a need for stimulation and also problems with being bored, having a parasitic lifestyle, having poor impulse control and early onset of behavioral problems, lacking long-term goals that are realistic, and being irresponsible. Again, we see a juvenile criminal history. And also for those who have been through the criminal justice system, we see that if they're released, they may end back up in the criminal justice system. And one of the features, of course, that we run into are definitional problems, because you're going to say, well, what is considered superficial charm, or what is considered shallow affect, and so that becomes problematic. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, this is just the pocketbook, the real manual is huge and weighs several pounds. But what I'd like to do is just point out, and again we run into some problems here, but I'll turn to the antisocial personality disorder, and in order to diagnose A is a pervasive pattern of disregard for the violation of the rights of others occurring since age 15, as indicated by 3 or more of the following, and then it lists 7 factors there. For example, failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior is one of them. Deceitfulness is another. Lack of remorse is another. And the big problem here is that if they exhibit 2 of those, then they wouldn't get the diagnosis. If they exhibit 3, yes. If they exhibit all 7, yes. And so one of the problems there is that if we have like this category, antisocial personality disorder, not antisocial personality disorder, but what we really have is a continuum of pathology, basically. So we have to take that into consideration. Same thing with Hare's assessment tool, that actually a number is assigned, and then there's a cutoff. Psychopath, not psychopath. Well, someone could be close, and then someone could be high on the psychopath scale, and then someone could be low but meet the criteria. And there may be different aspects where they're high and different aspects where they're low. In fact, we do find that's the case. So there's really different types of sociopaths, psychopaths, and those with antisocial personality disorder. Also, the antisocial personality diagnosis is important to mention. The individual must be at least 18, and the onset's before 15 years of age, and also to rule out other disorders such as bipolar or schizophrenia. So we run into these definitional problems as well, and some of that relates to what are considered the characteristics. And if you look at other scales, which I have, you'll see that, for example, Professor Patrick talks about a boldness item scale, a meanness scale, and a disinhibition scale. And so there's other scales as well, but I won't get into that at this particular time. But if you think about it, a diagnosis means a certain number of symptoms are present for a specific period of time. So that becomes relevant as well. So, how do we decide the time period? Is that somewhat subjective? Is it based on research? So we run into a lot of the traditional problems. First of all, we run into the issue of comorbidity, which means there may be multiple factors going on when it relates to mental illness, we might talk about comorbidity of multiple types of mental disorders. For example, someone could have depression and a substance abuse disorder, so that would be comorbid for those two disorders. And so, it may be a very different situation to have someone diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder on the one hand, and someone diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and cocaine addiction abuse, rather, on the other hand, or alcohol abuse problems. Also, we run into the issue of causes of psychopathy. And there's biological, genetic, and environmental explanations, as well as those that combine the biological, genetic, and environmental aspects. So, in your textbook, you'll read about genetic predispositions, you'll read about brain structural aspects, and also environmental. And of course, they can interrelate with each other. That some will talk about someone having the, symptoms of a psychopath or sociopath after having a particular injury or being exposed to certain environmental toxins or events. So we run into these problems pretty quickly, and so that's something that we want to consider as well. And of course, the early onset becomes a big issue as well, because we don't want to label kids, but in the same in a negative way that could impact them later on in their life. And create a lot of problems for them on the one hand, but on the other hand, we don't want to deny that there are some serious problems that some kids have that need to be addressed, or else they're going to end up in the criminal justice system or killing others or getting killed themselves. So we run into those problems as well. And so this whole idea becomes problematic. And I've run into the issue in my own work. Actually, things were going pretty smoothly for most of my career in regards to looking at this whole idea of the psychopath or the sociopath. And then I started studying genocide, and all of a sudden I've run into these characters, these people that have killed multiple times, have tortured, but they show no sign of pathology prior to the genocide, and then after the genocide's over and they're in prison or they have served their sentence, they seem to go back to this type of non-psychopathic behavior. So is there a temporary sociopath or psychopath? I'm reviewing a case right now that's really boggling my mind, and it's this guy who didn't have any signs of psychopathy, and then during a genocide for about 3 or 4 weeks he killed a whole bunch of people, tortured a whole bunch of people, beat people, just did all kinds of horrific, violent behaviors toward others, and then seemed to, after being arrested and going back into a non-psychopathic, sociopathic state in that sense. So we have to take a look at were those characteristics present during that time, but how do we make sense that they weren't before or after? Because remember, the psychopath or sociopath usually has a consistent pattern of this because it's embedded in the personality. So there are some questions. One of the cases I wrote about early on was an individual who killed around 70 or 80 people one day. But he didn't appear to have any pathology prior, and whatever pathology he had after, and I mean pathology, I mean major mental disorders, is that he had post-traumatic stress disorder apparently from what he had done. But this leads to some other problems as well, that we may have these multiple factors going on, and then we may ask about how this whole concept of the psychopath and psychopathy integrate into a lot of the research and work we see in the areas, for example, of terrorism and school shootings, and sexual assaults and bullying and other problems as well. So I'll wrap up right there just to give you a few things to think about. I probably have now created more questions than answers, which is okay in this field. And also, again, this is a classic, Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. I did want to mention real briefly that that there are psychopaths and sociopaths and those with antisocial personality disorder that do not engage in violent behavior, that do not go into the criminal justice system, but actually have families and live productive lives. And some sociopaths and psychopaths, it is believed to work in a variety of fields where they may have high-end jobs like CEOs of companies and the like. So I don't want to for you to have the impression that just because someone has these psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies means they're automatically going to go around maiming and killing people. That's not the case at all. So that's an interesting feature as well. In fact, and I'll wrap up here, as I just mentioned, that some of the characteristics of the psychopath or sociopath can be beneficial in certain fields of work. And this will wrap up this video. Thank you.